Let's talk about pressing. When it comes to the Champions League, we often think about really exciting in possession play, but sometimes out of possession can win you games. And so in this video, I want to talk about how Pep Guardiola's approach to pressing could win Manchester City the Champions League. But before we get to that, as always, we need to talk about what it is that Manchester City are doing in their high pressing phase. So on the board in front of me, I've got Manchester City as they line up as a 4-3-3. Usually, actually this season, it's more like a 3-2-2-3. Like this, with John Stones coming inside. But when Manchester City lose the ball, usually what they do is they move into what we call a 4-4-2 block. And how that happens is that Kevin De Bruyne usually pushes up alongside Erling Haaland. And then we have John Stones either dropping into the centre-back spot or going into the right-back spot as well. And then the midfield shifting around. So what we end up with here now is a 4-4-2 shape. Now let's imagine that the opposition have the ball. What Manchester City are going to do is they're going to sit in a block and they're going to try and move into a high press. They're going to try and squeeze the opposition backwards and to the side of the pitch. That looks like this. So you'll have Erling Haaland and Kevin De Bruyne around the pivot player. There's only one pivot player in this example, but if there's two pivot players, they'll be around them as well. And the idea is that they're going to pendulum around this pivot player. So if the ball comes out here, Haaland is going to push out. De Bruyne can then cover that pivot player. And the same on the other side. If the ball goes out here, De Bruyne pushes and Haaland is keeping an eye on that pivot player. Then across the rest of the field, everyone else is filling in. You have your midfielders operating against the other midfielders. Back line pushes up, so you've got your two centre-backs around their striker, and then your full-backs around the opposition wide players. Everyone is roughly player for player. Now the general idea, as we've said, is to try and squeeze the opposition into areas where it's hard for them to play the ball out. So let's imagine the keeper plays the ball to the centre-back on this side. What we're going to see is Erling Haaland doing one of these curved runs that we like to talk about, like this, where he's going to drop in here and press the opposition player out wide. The reason why he's doing that is because it stops the opposition player from being able to get easily back to the other side of the pitch. Once you've done that, what you can start doing is splitting the pitch in half. So we've already got Grealish on the fullback here. Gundogan will track this player here. De Bruyne, as we've said, is going to keep an eye on the pivot player. And then across the way, everyone is going to keep an eye on the opposition players. The player for player is much harder to actually play out in this sort of situation. Now in doing so, you are leaving players free on the other side, but the general idea is that because you've squeezed the players across here, it's hard for them to work the ball out. And even if they do manage to play the ball across, with the ball in the air, the amount of time it takes for Manchester City players to move across is enough for them to be able to defend very well as well. So the general principle is split the pitch in half, squeeze the opposition, make it hard for them to build up, and then try and win the ball back. So that's how the Manchester City high press has worked in the past. But this season, particularly in the Champions League, we've seen something slightly different emerging as a form of high pressing for Manchester City. So let's take a look at the first leg of the RB Leipzig game that Manchester City played in the Champions League to see how that works out. So here we've got on the board the Manchester City team. Interestingly enough, we've got Kyle Walker as the right back here, and that will become obvious why in a few moments. Now, what's important to remember when we talk about RB Leipzig is that they are going to try and keep the ball in narrow areas in particular. They like to get the ball directly down the field and counter-press and generate chances in that way. And so that means that they only leave two wide players outside this line of central players. Now, as you can see from Man City, if they're to move into a 4-4-2 shape, that means that they've got two players in the wide channels against one of the RB Leipzig players. And Halstenberg and Klosterman are not particularly adventurous fullbacks either. So that seems a little bit of a waste. So we saw a slightly different shape from the Manchester City team in this game out of possession. Most importantly, Pep Guardiola was clearly thinking that because RB Leipzig like to overload in the centre, he didn't want to give up the centre. So what we saw was Haaland going forward to press the centre back. But rather than Bernardo joining him alongside him, it was Mahrez who was being pushed into the centre as well. This meant that Man City still had three central midfielders who could match up against the opposition here. Everyone else could push up. Grealish was going to go on the wide centre-back. Man City were able to have a functional back three here, and Kyle Walker would push up on the other centre-back. It's almost like a 3-5-2 shape here. Just got a couple of screenshots to show you what that looked like in practice. So here we have Man City pressing this way. This is RB Leipzig with the ball, and as we can see, this is Riyad Mahrez. Normally he would be around this area, but as we can see, he's pushed up alongside Haaland here. And if we move the tape on slightly further, we can see Kyle Walker, the right back, is tasked with covering the player that Mahrez has left behind. So you can see that's how you end up with that 3-5-2 shape. Now this approach worked really well for Man City in the first half. They actually went in 1-0 up at half time. But in the second half, the manager of Leipzig, Marco Rose, made a change which actually started upsetting Man City's pressing system. What that change was is that he brought on Benjamin Hendricks. instead of Klostermann here. Now Hendricks is a little bit more of an expansive fullback, and what he was tasked with doing is pulling into this space behind Jack Grealish and starting to cause problems from RB Leipzig playing the ball into this sort of channel. Now we've already talked about how in Pep's 4-4-2, the forwards like to press up against the centre-backs. When that happens, you're leaving the double pivot players free. What will happen then is that Man City's midfielders will press up onto the double pivot players to stop them from being able to build up. And what you end up with then is a huge amount of space in this sort of area. You can see now that Leipzig have ended up with 4 players around Rodri. The defence are here, but obviously if you start playing the ball into this channel and you get it to Hendricks, then you can start actually finding this space in the middle. So by pressing through the middle, Man City end up actually giving away space deeper in the field. This caused problems, and actually RB Leipzig ended up scoring in that half, and the game ended 1-1. So when it comes to the second leg, Pep Guardiola wants to change up his high pressing a little bit. So here's the lineup of the 2 teams from that game. Again, it's the same principle of narrowness that we get from Red Bull teams. This time we've got slightly more expansive fullbacks for RB Leipzig, but despite the fact that you might think that Pep would want to give them more coverage in the wide areas, actually what he does is quite radical. He gives them less coverage. So let's have a look how it breaks down. So we have Erling Haaland and Kevin De Bruyne as the front line of the City press. But as we saw in the last fixture, we saw that actually Leipzig were able to get overloads in the middle, because when the forwards pressed up onto the centre-backs, it meant that the Man City midfielders had to move forward themselves. So what actually we see in this game is that Haaland and De Bruyne are much closer to these double pivot players, and they are less likely to actually step up onto the centre-backs. When the ball does go to the centre-backs, what we start seeing then is a more aggressive press from the wide players. So we have Grealish and Silva as the wide players, and they're going to sit between the centre-back and the full-back, and what they're going to do is when the ball comes in here, they're going to be really aggressive on that press to try and win the ball back. If the ball goes back to the keeper, that press will continue. It's a really, really aggressive press. And as you can see, we've already said that this is more aggressive because it leaves space in that wide area. And this is where the rest of the Man City team come in. So we have the central midfielders here. They have less work to do because they're being helped out by the front line of the press. We push the centre-backs up here, and then we have the 2 full-backs here ready to make these jumps into the wide players for the opposition when Jack Grealish, for example, in this instance has gone, to make sure that if the ball does end up here, that player is covered. So just to show you what that looks like in practice, here we've got Manchester City pressing this way down the field. Here's the 2 centre-backs for RB Leipzig. And in the previous game, we saw the 2 forward players in the press, in the centre, pushing out onto the centre-backs. But what we have now is we have Grealish and Silva here ready to jump onto that player. And then we can see here John Stones ready to make the jump onto David Raum if the ball actually ends up coming to him as well. So this is a really nice example of the 2 wide players doing the press, pressing out to in, and leaving the central players able to protect the middle a little bit more. So it's a really aggressive form of pressing. It requires a huge amount of coordination between all of the players, but the general principles remain the same. They're not going to allow RB Leipzig any leeway on the ball at all. They're going to make it hard for them to build up from the back. Sometimes it is going to leave them open at the back in these sorts of situations if this ball can get played over the top. But the general principle is if you make it so hard for the opposition to actually play it forward, then those sorts of balls will never actually happen. And that's what happened in this game, because RB Leipzig simply couldn't get the ball out of the back. Man City controlled the game and actually ended up winning the game 7-0. So that was how Pep Guardiola got Manchester City through the round of 16 in the Champions League. That brought them up against Bayern Munich. And again, we can see the pressing being really important in the first leg of that fixture between Bayern Munich and Man City. So here we have the 2 teams as they lined up for that fixture. Now, Bayern Munich are very different to RB Leipzig, because as we can see here, we've got Kingsley Coman and Leroy Sané, 2 really, really exciting wide players. They're going to try and get into those wider areas, which means this is a different prospect entirely from RB Leipzig. And the way that Pep responded to that was by having his wider players sit a little bit deeper. So we've got the first 2 players in the press here, Haaland and De Bruyne, and then we have Bernardo Silva on Davis, Grealish on Pavard. Now, Davis is a really exciting wide player as well, so Bernardo Silva sits a little bit deeper for this one. And then across the rest of the field, we have the same sort of thing happening. So the midfielders push up onto the double pivot. We've got the fullbacks on the wide players, and then we have our 2 centre-backs around the striker in this situation. But because Pep does want double coverage in these wide areas, because Bayern have so many exciting players in there, he does sit Silva and Grealish a little bit deeper than you might expect. And so as before, it falls to the 2 forward players to push onto the centre-backs in this situation. And so what we started seeing with the same problems that we'd seen in the Leipzig game, which is when you push your front line of the press up, your midfielders follow up to keep the double pivot quiet. And what you end up doing then is creating all of this space in the central area, which can then be exploited with a few smart passes. So if the goalkeeper can find one of the double pivot players, if the central midfielder isn't quick enough onto the jump, then you can find the ball in space, Musiala here, and then you have 3 players running at the back line, and it doesn't look very nice at all. So let's take a look at a couple of screenshots which show this up really nicely. So again, Man City pressing this way down the field, and as you can see, the front line of the press here, Haaland and De Bruyne jumping up onto the centre-backs in each instance. We can see Bernardo Silva here much deeper, keeping an eye on Alphonso Davies. And you can see as well, Rodri having to pull all the way out to cover the double pivot because these two players have jumped. Here's another shot which shows that structure nicely. So we've got the two wide players covering the fullbacks. We can see the forward line of the press jumping onto the centre-backs, and as a result, the midfielders having to move forward and generating space behind. And you can see Bayern players are going to try and exploit that space. This is Musiala dropping out, dragging one of the centre-backs with him as well. And what that means is that Bayern actually were able to work the ball into this really dangerous pocket of space in between the line of the midfield and the defenders. You can see here Pavard is on the ball. He's got three players ahead of him, 1v1 against their respective defenders in that back line. This is a really dangerous situation because you carry that ball and then you can lay one of the players in and it just pulls this back line completely apart. So we're seeing the same problems emerging, that because Pep is worried about the wide areas, actually the central area opens up and it makes the wide areas dangerous anyway. So you've got to do something to sort this out. And how Pep does that is by being really radical again in the wide areas when he's pressing, not making sure he's got double coverage, but actually going even more aggressive. So whereas before we saw the two players in the front line of the press jumping up onto the centre-backs, actually Pep gets them being a little bit more conservative in the second half of the game. And what that means is that he's going to press the centre-backs with his wide players here. And so if the goalkeeper passes out to the centre-back here, you see the wide player coming in here doing a really aggressive press. If the ball goes back to the goalkeeper, then Grealish will carry on his run. And the principle is that if you are really aggressive in your high press, then the goalkeeper is unable to be able to exploit that weakness that you've left here. Now, if the ball does end up over here, then you will see a series of jumps across the rest of the team to solve that problem. So you'll see Ake jumping up against his counterpart, the other side fullback here, and then Gundogan can cover Zane, the player that Ake left behind. And then we'll see Rodri making sure that he's patrolling this area as well. And so actually what you end up doing is by being really aggressive in those wide areas, actually making yourself more at risk in that wide area, you've actually done a much better job of covering the central spaces, and that means it won't actually end up with those dangerous attacks that we saw in the first half. What does that look like? Well, here is a screenshot from the second half of the Bayern game, and as you can see now, these forward pressers in the front line are much deeper. They're keeping an eye on the double pivot players. That means that the Man City midfielders don't have to press up, but we can see here the wide players ready to make their jumps onto the centre-back when that happens. So when the ball is passed to Upamecano here, Jack Grealish is ready to make that really aggressive press on here. You can see that Pavard is left free here now, but that is just the weakness that is introduced by having this really aggressive press onto the centre-back. But actually in this instance, the centre-back can't find Pavard. He plays it to Sommer. Sommer actually ends up hitting it long. So rather than the ball ending up in this area under the control of a Bayern player, it just goes over the head of the Manchester City defenders, and Nathan Ake can just see the ball out as well. So by being really aggressive in the press, Man City were able to control the game much better. And one of the additional benefits was that actually by being super aggressive, Bayern were destabilised and Man City were able to win the ball back in a couple of occasions high up the field, and that actually contributed to their goals as well. So here we have another example of a tweak in pressing actually helping Pep get his team through a Champions League fixture and carrying them through to the next round. So the next time you're watching a Champions League game and you're really enjoying that in-possession play with the elite players from around the world, just remember that actually sometimes, kids, pressing wins you games.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including journalists dedicated to each Premier League team, so every fan gets the coverage they deserve, not just the big clubs. And you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.